Today we will start with an essay by A.K. Ramanujan. Is there an Indian way of thinking? An informal essay. Uh, it's quite interesting as an essay, and as you can see, the title itself is provocative. There is a question mark, there is a proclamation that it's an informal essay, but as we will see, if it is really an informal essay or where the informality or the formality of the essay lies in. But before that, let's have a look at Ramanujan's own life and his own career itself. A.K. Ramanujan was a well-known linguist. He could be thought of as in three different ways, at least, among many other things that he did. He was primarily a bilingual writer or a multilingual translator or a scholar of folklore, poetry, and oral cultures from India itself. Uh, and as you can see that these multiple tags tell us that here was a person who was quite scholarly, quite erudite in diverse literary, cultural expressions of India. As I said, he was a bilingual poet. I'm sure many of us would have read his poetry in English. He is also a poet in Kannada, and he also is well known for his translations from Tamil and Kannada into English of poetry and folk tales, which he himself translated, and then he collaborated with others to translate folk tales from other languages of India into multiple volumes that shape our understanding of orality, folk tales, and poetry from India. Uh, he was also a scholar, and then this essay is part of the volume or part of his collected works. If one goes through just the content page of this collection, one would realize his varied interest and his erudition. Multiple trajectories in which Ramanujan influenced Indian scholarship may be thought of in terms of translation studies. His essays and works on translation have shaped translation and thinking and theories of translation in India. As I mentioned earlier, folklore itself and orality. These areas cannot but do with, cannot but engage with Ramanujan and his scholarship in these areas. So, as we can roughly see, three major areas of intervention: one as a bilingual poet, one as a translator, one another one as a scholar. So, Ramanujan, as we understand, had a very broad and comprehensive understanding of Indian literatures to Indian literatures, and that comes across in this essay itself. Ramanujan was also, it's very important to also understand his location. Ramanujan taught at very different places in India, and before in the 1960s moving to US where he stayed and pursued his scholarship, mostly at the University of Chicago. And shaped the understanding of South Asian languages itself. He was a linguist himself. So, all of those interests come into this essay. And as I drew your attention to the title itself, uh, is there an Indian way of thinking? And as I had uh, articulated in the first classes itself, that we will be looking at the constituents of the title of this course, Indian Writing in English, and we have been focusing our energies on the last word, that is English, and some bit on the writing part. And this essay is actually tries to engage with two of those terms in the title itself, Indian and writing. So if we have discussed travelogues and novels, here is an essay, a very different form itself, a very different kind of writing itself, very different discourse, and also shows that Indians were able to write in the essay format. Now, and also the more important question that is asked in this essay by Ramanujan is about the question of Indian, that what exactly is Indian, right? Is there an Indian way of thinking? And we'll look into that question as we go into the essay itself. But before that, it is important to pay attention to the title and the second half of the title, an informal essay. What does he mean by it? Why is the need to say that it's an informal essay? By nature, essays are formal. We have quite a list of essays in the British tradition itself. So we have Montaigne, Bacon, Cowley, Charles Lamb, and people like De Quincey, who have written wonderful essays. And by the time we come to 20th century, there are like masters of the essay form. We have people like Lawrence, Foster, Woolf, Joyce, all the major writer, Eliot, who write in the essay format. And essay has been quite influential genre itself in the British tradition itself, right? So, and it's always been about serious discussions. It's always a formal one. What does he mean by an informal essay? Does he mean to say that the inquiry is not serious, or the topic is not serious, or the mode of inquiry is probably not serious? There is an informality to it, probably because the way that he argues, or the way he presents it, or the themes that come up in the essay are not formal as such? Or is he trying to tell us that it's probably not in the way that essays have been structured in the British tradition, in the canonical way? Here probably is more of a conversation in that way. And then you will see that this essay is a conversation between what he situates as the Western and the Indian way. So there is a kind of a dialectic that emerges in this essay, and is that the need to call it an informal essay? So we can think about various possibilities of this kind when we look at this title itself. Now, after the title, there is a quote by Walter Benjamin. There's an epigraph by Walter Benjamin, which is helpful to think about, and it's quite an interesting quote from Benjamin that we see here. The quote is this: Walter Benjamin once dreamed of hiding behind a phalanx of quotation, which, like the highwaymen, would ambush the passing reader and rob him of his convictions. This is not quoted from Benjamin. It's about Benjamin. So there is again no citation, as you can see. There is hardly a citation that is there of Walter Benjamin in that, or from where it is quoted. So we are just told an anecdote in that way to begin with, something that looks like an epigraph but actually seems like a snippet or an anecdote, that he once dreamed of hiding behind a phalanx of quotations, which, like highwaymen, would ambush the passing reader and rob him of his conviction. Interesting quote which tries to tell us that the role of quotations itself, right? That when I'm citing something, when I'm quoting something, what happens to the authorial voice? Am I presenting my ideas? How do I navigate those quotations and citations to present my ideas? Or and what does it do to the reader? That when the reader comes across a lot of citations, does the reader think that it's already a very scholarly piece and doesn't try to critically engage with it, because there is already so many quotations that probably the author has done the duty for them? Very interesting, because it situates the reader and the author in a very complex equation, and says that somewhere quotations, the use of quotations, rob the reader of his convictions. Probably they are able to change the reader's mind, the quotations themselves, and the quotations kind of ambush the reader. And the metaphor of the highwaymen, that you probably have something in your possession and you are robbed of them because of these quotations. So the quotations have a powerful way of pursuing, steering the conversation mostly towards the way that the author wants to present them. So one should not be just thinking of quotations as simply evidences of the author's point of view. They are rhetorical devices, is what he is trying to tell us. Now that's pretty interesting as a epigraph to begin with, because in this essay we'll see a lot of quotations, and then it will become clearer as we pass through the questions itself and various sections of the essay. So he starts by again asking the reader, and the reader seems to be at the forefront of this entire exercise, as it is an informal essay. So you can see that it's not just a writer writing and trying to pursue a thread or a line of thought, and the reader just reading it, the serious thoughts that the author has pursued and perused and has put forward. It seems to be like a conversation. It's meant in that way. He says that like an exercise for his actors that Stanislavski used to do, he wants to phrase this question in different ways by putting the stress on different terms of the title itself. He says, my question, is there an Indian way of thinking, is a good one for such an exercise, depending on where the stress is placed. If you remember in the first class itself, and we were trying to think about Indian writing in English in that way, and that's why I'm again bringing that discourse here, that Indian writing in English, right? So we had looked at English, now is the turn of looking at the question of Indian, and that's what he's doing it. And I had invoked him at that point itself. So he asks, is there an Indian way of thinking? He formulates 4 questions. The first one, there is a stress on is there an Indian way of thinking. In the second one, the stress is on and. is there an Indian way of thinking? The third question, the stress is on Indian. Is there an Indian way of thinking? In the fourth one, the stress is on thinking. Is there an Indian way of thinking itself? So, these four questions obviously have very different answers itself, right? So, is there an Indian way of thinking? The first question, the question on temporality, is there an Indian way of thinking anymore? Probably the question comes from an understanding that there was an Indian way of thinking. There is not so much now. He says that if you want to learn about the Indian way of thinking, do not ask your modern cityfied Indians. That will be probably the answers. Go to the Pandits, the Vaidikas, the old texts. On the contrary, India never changes. India never changes. Under the veneer of the modern, Indians still think like the Vedas. So, there are two answers that are possible, that there was an Indian way of thinking and there is none that is right now, or there may be another way of looking at it where there was the Indian way of thinking has not changed. It's only the cities, the modernity has come in, but Indians still think the same way like they are, like from the Vedas. The second question, is there an Indian, that is there one way of one Indian way of thinking? The question will probably have answers like there is no single Indian way of thinking. There are little traditions, vernacular traditions, there are the great traditions, there are the ancient traditions, there are the modern traditions, and there are the rural, urban, classic, folk, and each language, region, caste will have a different different knowledge system or a way of thinking. You will find, as has been many ways of thinking in India, and he reminds us of Sahitya Academy's line, Indian literature is one, though written in many languages. So, same can be said about an Indian way of thinking, that there are many ways of thinking in India, and so therefore, though they are called Indian, it's very diverse. The singularity here only means a confluence of multiplicities. The third question, is there an Indian way of thinking? And this is where our interest should be picked. So, the third question might be answered, what we see in India is nothing special to India. It's nothing but pre-industrial, pre-printing press, face-to-face, agricultural. It's not typically Indian. One can dismiss it like that, that like, is this Indian in any way? Then the Marxist, Freudians, McLuhanists all have their label for stage India is in according to their scheme of social evolution. India is only one example. Others of course would argue that the uniqueness of India. So, you will, on the one hand, you will have people who will be saying that India is probably underdeveloped. If you look at answers from Marxist, economist, psychologist, some might say that we are at a very different kind of a developing stage. We are probably agricultural, agrarian economy. Some might say we are a feudal society, but others would, there is nothing unique in that sense or Indian in that sense, many other. But whereas others would probably try to say that there are some things that are very unique in India. Look at what has happened to Indo-Europeans in India. They would say that their language gets short in with retroflexes and their syntax with nominal compounds. They lose their nerve. The British are the most recent example. Look what happens to Buddhism, Islam and the Parsis. There is an Indian way, and it imprints the patterns, all things that enter into the subcontinent. It's inescapable and it is bigger than all of us. So, while one group will probably try to cancel it and say that, no, there is nothing called essentially an Indian way of thinking, others would say that, look what has happened, like there is a syncretic consciousness that is called Indian. Look at how Buddhism has changed, emerged and changed. In India, Islam and the Parsis, and if you look at languages that have come to India and what has happened to them, so there seems to be an Indian way about it. If you go out and think about food, there will be certain representative Indian ways of cooking, Indian dishes that may be thought about. So there's some will argue that definitely there is something unique called Indian. Probably the movie industry may represent certain characteristics that are Indian in that way. The fourth question, is there an Indian way of thinking? Might seem a bit of a patronizing way of formulating the question, that whether Indians think at all, right? That's what Ramanujan also asks us to think about what the stress might mean. It is the West is materialistic, rational. Indians have no philosophy, only religion, no positive sciences, not even psychology. In India, matter is subordinated to spirit, rational thought to feeling, intuition. And even when people agree that this is the case, we can have arguments and for and against it. That if India did not have philosophy or positive sciences or psychology, then what would happen to the ancient Indian knowledge texts, both from the great and the little traditions, the vernacular traditions, the very local traditions that we tend to think about. Probably they were not thought of in the way that West categorizes them as philosophy or cognitive sciences or psychology or any kind of social sciences, positive sciences itself, in the empirical way that they are defined or categorized, but probably they had something else. That's what Ramanujan also tells us. All this entire exercise then for Ramanujan brings to us that we need to understand the diversity that is there in this term called Indian. Indian becomes a very complex term itself, and then he goes to unpack this diversity, this multiplicity, this heterogeneity that is there in this word Indian itself. So then he goes on to discuss various characteristics of, drawn from the scholarship on India, various characteristics of this thing called Indian. The first characteristic that he talks about is called inconsistency. The second one is the non-distinction between the self and non-self, or the inside and the outside. And the third one is the binary of the particular versus universal, that in India there seems to be no rule of universality, something that applies across the board. There seems to be very particular context specific rules and ideas and knowledges that are there. So he discerns that there are these three typical characteristics that are associated with India, and this is drawn from both Eastern and Western scholarship on India itself, and he goes through many of them, and this is where we'll see a lot of citations coming in, and then we'll come back to that question, that what exactly do citations do at the end of this end of the text itself. And so he goes on to look at each of these three primary characteristics of the Indian. The first one being inconsistency, and for him this was posed by his father very well. He said, my father's clothes represented his inner life very well. He was a South Indian Brahmin gentleman. He wore neat white turbans or Sri Vaishnava caste mark in his earlier pictures, a diamond earring, yet wore two-tail ties and Croman's buttons and collar studs, donned English serge jackets over his muslin dhotis, which he wore draped in traditional Brahmin style. He often wore the tartan patterned socks and silently well polished leather shoes when he went to the university, but he carefully took them off before he entered the inner quarters of the house. He was a mathematician and astronomer, but he was also a Sanskrit scholar and an expert astrologer. He had two kinds of exotic visitors, an American and English mathematician who called on him when they were on a visit to India, and local astrologers, Orthodox Pandits, who wore splendid gold embroidered shawls dowered by Maharaja. Uh, and one can see the inconsistency, and that's what he says, that like he was just newly converted by the scientific attitude of Russell and was troubled by his father traversing these multiple worlds, one of being an astronomer and then an astrologer. How are you reconciling these two different worlds, one guided by scientific rationality, another through what would be so called myth, belief, the non rational, spiritual, religious, in that order, right? So, how did he bring those two together? And for him, for his father, who nonchalantly would say that, besides, don't you know, the brain has two lobes, that like there are two lobes of the brain, so the brain can actually put in those two things. And then Ramanujan says that this is typical of the Indian inconsistency, that you wear shoes, well polished leather shoes, to the university, but when you come to the house, you take them off, and many of us still do it, right? Don't wear shoes inside the house in that sense, because the house somewhere has a very different connotation, the inside has a very different connotation than the outside per se, right? So, one can see these various different inconsistencies coming in together, which also gets dubbed as the Indian hypocrisy, and that obviously is talked about in very different ways. He says both in the third section, he says both Englishmen and modern Indians have been dismayed and angered by this kind of inconsistency. They all seem to agree on one thing, the Indian trait of hypocrisy. Indians do not mean what they say and say different things at different times. So, one can see that this kind of inconsistency being there. You don't do what you say. So, as he says, that do not mean what they say and say different things at different times. A very funny example would be like, if you ask for direction and the person confidently tells you that you go straight and take a right. Right. So, which is typical in India in that sense. If you ask for direction, the confidence with which it comes and shows that like, oh, okay, are you sending me in the wrong direction? Don't know, deliberately or not so deliberately in that sense. But yeah, this is one of the characteristics of India in that sense, that he unpacks. There are two more characteristics that are there. The second one being the distinction between self and the non-self, and the third one being the binary of particular versus the general.